Welcome back, everyone. This is our fourth and final module as part of our virtual workshop, Complete Streets for Complete Communities. We're here as part of the Active People Healthy Nation initiative to get 27 million people active by 2027. And so today we're going to be talking about implementing for Complete Streets. But I would also just remind you, we started off with the benefits for Complete Streets. We discussed designing for active transportation and land use. Tuesday, if you remember, we were here talking about equitable development and a brief run through about coalition building. And today I'm very excited for us to have two instructors with us from our team. We have Eric Sundquist who is the director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and our own Cole Sakaro, who was with us for benefits of Complete Streets, who is a program manager with Complete Streets at Smart Growth America. So we're very excited to have both of them. They've been working closely with the team on the ground in order to prepare this module. And so I'll just hand it right over to them.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to jump right into the presentation. We have a lot to discuss with you today, starting with a brief overview of funding and funding allocation as a barrier to Complete Streets, which my colleague Eric is going to tackle momentarily. I'm going to talk to you a bit about equitable project selection criteria, sharing a real-world example from the Chattanooga Transportation Planning Organization, turn things back to Eric, who will talk about redefining success in project development and selection, going over concepts like level of service and others that are pretty deeply ingrained in much of transportation work, but often serve as pretty difficult barriers to actually implementing Complete Streets and revising those processes and procedures. The last piece we're going to discuss is going to be an actual case study of a street that many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. Before we launch into that, we'll very, very quickly just remind you of some of the key points that we discussed in the first three modules, just so you have everything fresh of mind. Our goal with the case study is to really bring together all of the concepts that we have covered with you over the course of these four modules. Eric, before I turn things over to you to talk about funding, is there anything else that you wanted to say up front about today's progression?
No, that covers it. I think we should just get going.
All right.
Okay, so very quickly on funding, obviously this is when you survey people about why Complete Streets have not happened or what the barriers are. Often the first thing that people mention is funding. So we want to just touch on that to begin with, not that it's not an issue, but we want to put in some context before we go into the distributional and some of the rules of thumb that Cole just mentioned. So if you could go to the next slide, Cole. The point I just want to make is there is a lot of money in transportation. And don't take these numbers to be exact, because I didn't have time to go through these budgets carefully. There's probably some double counting here. There's some things I missed, but suffice it to say that there's over $1 billion a year going into transportation in the region, probably significantly more than that. If you go to the next slide. And the stuff that we're talking about often is really cheap. So sometimes just a couple bollards to keep cars from turning left into pedestrians might be under $1,000. A curb ramp that makes all the difference in the world for somebody in a wheelchair to be able to get to the grocery store might be under $1,000. Sidewalks, you know, you can see depending on how long they are, may not be very much. Flashing beacons, and I won't go through all of these, but even the hard, bigger items here are in the $10,000 range, and they can easily go higher. I don't want to mislead. You can make things more expensive if you have to buy land, things like that. It can be much more expensive, but these are median values. So the point is that a lot of this stuff is within budget, or a budget that you could easily sort of imagine within that $1.5 billion that is being spent. Just a little bit of context. We'll let it go at that and turn it back over to Cole about the distributional aspects of how money is being spent.
Thanks, Eric, for that quick lead into this section. So as Eric just said, there's really very often a major barrier to complete streets is the perception that there's simply not funding. And often the case is that actually there's quite a lot of funding for transportation more broadly, but there's a perception that that funding cannot be reallocated to support active transportation. So what I'm going to talk you through is a very basic introduction to how inequity often becomes embedded in how we decide which projects to fund and where to place them. Starting with a very, very basic, oversimplified introduction to what is project selection. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are already pretty familiar with this process, but just in case you're not, there are almost always guaranteed to be more projects in the queue than there is funding available for at this exact moment. This could be anything from building a new highway to widening an existing road to adding sidewalks or safety interventions for safer crossings, adding bike lanes. This also includes things like operation and maintenance to repair roads and sidewalks. The process of project selection is very simply deciding which of those projects are going to receive funding and move forward. This process ranges quite a lot in communities around the country. Sometimes there is no real standardized process at all. The decisions are made based on moment-to-moment politics, based on priorities of elected officials, or very often based on squeaky wheels, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Moving toward more formal project selection criteria, where prospective projects are graded according to specific performance measures, can be a really good intervention point to make sure that complete streets, and equitable complete streets especially, are embedded into this decision-making process as a matter of routine. I'm sure you've probably heard the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and in the context of transportation, it's very often true. When I say squeaky wheels, what I mean is there is some existing process for members of the community to reach out, often in the form of a complaint or a request, to report a project that needs attention. That could be something as small as a pothole that needs repair. That could be something larger, like requesting a sidewalk where one is not currently present, or to express support for projects that are already in the queue but haven't necessarily been allocated funding. This squeaky wheels process, as I said, is very common in communities around the country, and certainly it's at work in Charlotte as well. And it does play a very important role. Unfortunately, it also has some really crucial limitations and therefore should not be the sole way that you decide how to allocate funding for projects. Just to refresh your memory, in case you were not able to join us for our first module, there are some really substantial barriers to participation that basically results in the squeaky wheels not capturing a widespread representative, it's not widespread representative input from all parts of your community. Often squeaky wheels is going to really bias whose voices you're hearing. You're going to hear from people who have the luxury of time to spend on reaching out proactively to government. Think about other barriers to time, such as childcare, such as the long commute times via transit we discussed for folks who may not have access to a personal vehicle. Things like internet access are certainly becoming more apparent as a key barrier, not just to engagement, but even to learning in the era of COVID-19. So accessing those online portals might not be something that some members of your community are even able to do. Some of these barriers to participation really more pertain to in-person events such as transportation. But again, I'll link this back to time as a barrier. Those that are spending 45 minutes to an hour and a half each way commuting to work have much less free time to dedicate to things like going into a government portal and reporting some of the problems that they're witnessing. But most importantly, I want to remind you of another thing we discussed in the first module, which is faith in the system. As we've discussed, many of the transportation decisions that have been made broadly across the country, both historically and in the present, have not actually served the well-being or interests specifically of low-income Black and Latinx communities. The example that I mentioned in Module 1 was the national highway system serving as a way to clear, divide, and obstruct these same neighborhoods. As a result, what you're seeing here, you've seen before if you joined us before, is from research out of Rutgers University that shows that more than half of Black and Hispanic Latino people surveyed believe it unlikely that the government will make requested improvements. If you don't believe that government's going to respond to your requests, why would you spend the time to make them? All this to say, Squeaky Wheels is a great way to engage aspects of your community that are already plugged into what's going on with transportation. Those proactive, vocal advocates for their own communities and their own interests are going to thrive under a Squeaky Wheels model. But the parts of your community that have traditionally been underrepresented and underserved are perhaps not going to reach you through Squeaky Wheels. If this is the only way you decide which projects receive priority, you're going to continue to leave those interests behind. This is a great moment just to clarify the difference between equality and equity. The graphic you see here comes from Race Forward. As you can see, the person on the left is standing on much higher ground than the person on the right. However, they've each been given the same box to stand on. The result is that the person on the left, who really doesn't need the box at all, is still benefiting from that equal distribution of resources. While the person on the right, though receiving that same equal distribution of resources, is still unable to watch the game. This is the difference between equality and equity. Equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is tailoring the distribution of resources to meet very, very different needs. And you'll perhaps recall this graphic, again from Module 1, that shows we're not standing on equal ground. Historically, and even presently, resources have been allocated in an inequitable way. What you see here is that high-income neighborhoods nationwide tend to have much more comprehensive sidewalk coverage. They also are more likely to have adequate lighting, to have crosswalks, and to have traffic calming measures to improve safety for people walking, biking, and rolling. We are not standing on equal ground, and so equality as a method of distributing projects is not going to help us bridge this divide between high and low income communities. So let's look at how this plays out in this hypothetical example. Here are two imaginary neighborhoods in Charlotte. Neighborhood A is very well resourced, very well plugged into what's going on at the city and at the region in terms of decision making. Neighborhood B has some resources, but not as many. We might even imagine that neighborhood A is higher income and perhaps has a higher percentage of residents who are white, who are wealthy, and who have access to a personal vehicle. While neighborhood B perhaps has a more diverse distribution of races and ethnicities, lower average median household income, and perhaps a higher percentage of the population that depends on transit, walking, biking, and rolling to get around. When we move forward with a Squeaky Wheels approach, what you can see is that neighborhood A succeeds in continuing to leverage for more resources, while neighborhood B does not. This widens the divide between these two neighborhoods even further. And in an equality model, each of these neighborhoods receives the same investment in complete streets. However, the result is that the divide between them does not change at all. Prioritizing equity in project selection would ensure that neighborhood B is prioritized for investment in everything from walking, biking, and rolling infrastructure to maintenance to first mile, last mile access to transit and safety improvements and so on. And this is what any community that wants to prioritize equitable complete streets implementation needs to strive for. Before I move on to a real life example of a community that successfully changed their approach to project selection, I want to pause for a moment to hear a bit more from all of you who have much more intimate on the ground experience in Charlotte. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share for a moment so we can see one another, but I'd be curious before we move forward to learn a little bit more about your experiences in how Charlotte makes decisions about where to invest in complete streets.
Has anyone had an experience in their neighborhood where you've seen improvements made to provide more space for people walking and biking or accessing transit? We can definitely share some examples, but we would love to hear from you all about your personal experiences.
Hi, this is Maureen. I'd like to just share what we have experienced on the east side, and it's something that we're working on, and that is a lot of disconnected neighborhoods. We're older neighborhoods, and so there's a lot of retrofitting that really needs to be done. It's expensive, but it needs to be done for connectivity.
Absolutely, it's a really good point and a really difficult challenge to overcome when it comes to implementing complete streets. Thank you very much for sharing that, Maureen.
This is Dana Stujenki with the town of Matthews, adjacent to Charlotte. And I work for the town, and something that our council members are really interested in is the gap projects. Like, what little pieces can we put out there that are sort of low-hanging fruit, but still expensive, because nothing's cheap when it comes to infrastructure. How we can potentially get some sort of those gaps filled to complete a network. And that's something that we, using GIS and technology and just walking around, trying to fill those gaps.
And I know that Charlotte has taken a similar approach as well, that there are some of those kind of low-hanging fruit areas that can be done pretty quickly and relatively inexpensively. And then there are other improvements that really need to be part of larger projects. So it's been something we've advocated for both of those things to happen in parallel, and recognizing that they can happen on different timelines, but we'd like to see all of it sped up a little bit more.
Any other examples to share before I move on? Experiences that you've had or observed where the way that projects are distributed either does or does not match the goals of the community more broadly?
Well, I would like just to share our experiences in getting protected lanes on the plaza, which then made that street more complete. Took 3 to 4 years of work with a very engaged neighborhood in Charlotte. And it's about 1 mile in length, and currently still kind of disconnected from other similar, like a network. So just to give the, perspective of everything, that was a process, and I know things are changing, and especially since you get one of those types of infrastructure on the ground, people get to see the benefit of them. So hopefully that will speed up the process, but just historically, as an example.
Thank you for sharing that, Eric. And it is a really great example of how complete streets projects in isolation can be a lengthy uphill battle. Whereas once you have a strong policy on the books, once that policy has helped you to change your decision-making processes, that uphill battle becomes more a matter of routine and can really help, as you said, Eric, too, once there's support for complete streets, once folks have seen what it looks like, what it can do for their communities, how it can change their experiences of the street and their quality of life. It makes it much more easy to make every project a complete streets project without that 3-4 years of engagement and fighting to change those priorities.
Cole, this is Kenya Templeton. I find that being in a community of color in Charlotte, that when we bring up projects or things that we need, it's going back to some of the hurdles that you presented, that if you're going into places that didn't have the infrastructure and they're developed neighborhoods, it's more costly. But my question is always, at what point do we stop continuing to put in infrastructure dollars into neighborhoods that already have infrastructure to give us something in those communities that don't have any infrastructure whatsoever? Because to tell us that we're not going to get it until there's a project that's already in motion in which they can add that to it, it really goes back to the point of people not, they're not trusting the government, because you're waiting until basically gentrification comes to my neighborhood before you're gonna put in a Charlotte neighborhood improvement program or any kind of infrastructure in my neighborhood.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kenya. I wish it wasn't the first time I heard an example like that, because the situation that you're describing is very real and very prevalent. And you're right, we can't wait for complete streets to become an opportunity for gentrification to improve infrastructure in communities that have continued to be left behind. My hope in sharing the next example about how to change project selection to be more in line with community goals, including equity, is to show one way that you can take some of the squeaky wheels in politics out of that decision making and make sure that the communities with the highest need are also the highest priority, and that those investments, while more costly to do those retrofits, are seen as an important priority for spending. I see a hand raised. Shannon, did you want to add something before I move on? I'm seeing that your audio might not be connected. If you're able to resolve that, please, to you, Shannon, and to really anyone else, do feel free to come off mute while I'm presenting and chime in with questions, other examples to share. I absolutely want this to be a dialogue, not just me talking at you. That being said, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was going to share my observations. I think it's a mix in Charlotte. Certainly, the squeaky wheel approach is often needed to get infrastructure improvements. It's not always needed. I think the city does look at where there are needs and sometimes makes investments based on where they see a need based on their own analysis. But I think one of the challenges too is I know there's a real fear, within CDOT and perhaps for some members of council, that if they're going to do something, a project, let's say a complete streets project that is going to be controversial, in other words, reallocating space that's currently used by motorists, if they think that's going to be controversial, they will not voluntarily do that. They'll only do that when they know the neighborhood or know the businesses along that route want it. So I think the squeaky wheel comes into play when it's a controversial project. They won't often enter into a controversial project unless there's been demand for it.
For those that
does that make sense?
I think so. I had a little bit of trouble hearing the earlier parts of what you said, but I think your point ultimately is that because of the trade-offs where complete streets is reallocating space away from vehicles to other uses and the resulting impacts on congestion and taking away parking and so on, that there is a hesitation politically to move forward with a complete streets project that's going to be considered controversial. But having the squeaky wheels, having evidence that the community is asking for it, erases some of that controversy. Did I understand you correctly?
Perfectly. That's exactly what I meant to say.
Mm-hmm. It is a great point, but I guess what I do want to highlight is I think that there's a really interesting nexus between the point that you just made and the point that Kenya just made. I think it's a question of who are complete streets for. If complete streets are being implemented in a way that the community of color that is residing in a place right now is not actually going to benefit from it. It's not serving the kinds of trips and the locations of trips that they're taking. It's not meeting their needs, and they're not seeing themselves in the outcomes. That might be a really an important red flag that complete streets is being implemented for that economic drive of gentrification. That project's not actually for the community living there now. It's for a community that developers are hoping will move in and increase the tax revenue base. I think there is an opportunity for certain and a need to improve safety, to improve connectivity in neighborhoods that have been underserved. But I think the challenge is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience to build that trust with that community, to understand that community's priorities and needs so that those projects can actively serve them. And it is, I see that it's much more low-hanging fruit. It's a much easier political win to put a bike lane in the nice white neighborhood that's going to cheer you on and vote for you again. There's certainly a disincentive for elected officials to spend time, resources, and attention on a project that might be more controversial or that might not even be in place by the time they're up for re-election. These are very real challenges that perpetuate these inequities in the system. I think your point is well taken, but I think it's also something that we need to be cognizant of if we want to overcome these disparities and actively serve the communities that we've continued to leave behind, rather than continuing to make decisions that are actually against their interests.
Can I just add one important piece and part to this? The network has to be thought of and how those are connected, because even if you put complete street projects into the areas that need them, if they're not connected to where those folks need to go, then it's just a waste, because they're going to end up at a dead end or to an unsafe area, and then end up putting their lives in danger. So that's also another piece of why you need the network and an overall larger plan with equity in mind.
It's a great point. A bike lane that leads to nowhere is not really serving anybody very well.
Cole, I can share one more example of how the city chooses where to put complete streets projects. Just a couple of years ago, the city adopted a Vision Zero goal to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries by 2030. And what that looked like operationally, one of the parts of it is that the city used to focus on high accident locations and really looking at where crashes are occurring. And with the adoption of Vision Zero, they shifted to really focusing on the high injury network, which is the 10% of street segments that have disproportionately higher rates of fatalities and serious injuries. So they shifted the focus on where to build traffic safety projects from just looking at where cars are crashing, which also included people, of course, but also really now focusing on where are people getting really seriously injured and killed. And so now I think that has been a positive shift in that focus.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and move on, but as I said, open invitation to come off of mute and interrupt me with questions, examples. If something is ringing true, if something is ringing false, please, I'd love to hear from you. With that being said, I'd like to share an example from the Chattanooga, Hamilton County, North Georgia area, TPO, Transportation Planning Organization, or the Chiconga TPO. I'm just going to go on and refer to it as Chattanooga. So again, I assume that many of you on the call are familiar with the role of an MPO, but just in case you're not, really, this is a regional body that serves a number of counties and jurisdictions in a specific area, usually centered around a major metropolitan area. They are responsible for every 5 years putting out long-range transportation plans that include funding a package of projects across those jurisdictions that are paid for with federal funds. So really, the MPO has an important role to play in determining what are the priorities for how that federal funding is going to be spent through the region. While preparing for their 2040 long-range plan, the TPO discovered that priorities across the community are split pretty evenly. For example, if we look at traffic flow and road building, capacity, or widening highways, making sure that you're not sitting in traffic, it worked out to about 27.4% of people believe that that is the most important priority for the upcoming transportation budget. However, sidewalks and bikeways, or active transportation, also had a pretty similar percent who thought that that is the most important priority. So what we're seeing here is that the priority across the region is split pretty evenly between meeting these different needs and these different trade-offs. The spending, on the other hand, is not split evenly at all. The transportation dollars in Chattanooga were consistently being spent on projects dedicated just to motor vehicle traffic. And TPO staff knew that that was not ever going to change unless they changed their funding allocation. Their goal here was to come up with a way to reward dollars to projects so that it actually matched community priorities in the region, not to keep putting all of that money into capacity. What they realized, and apologies, I know this is a very blurry screenshot from their plan, they realized that the challenge here was that although they already had a pretty robust way of selecting projects, they had this rubric of metrics that they grade projects on. What they realized is that every project, no matter what the context, no matter what the scale, was competing under the same series of metrics. That meant that a project to widen a major road between two communities was competing against a small scale connection to a grocery store or a school on metrics like level of service. They realized that these active transportation projects were not able to compete against those multi-million-dollar highway projects. And what they needed to do is actually come up with a way to evaluate projects that was context sensitive, that took into account that different projects serve different needs and meet different goals. Specifically, they identified 3 different kinds of projects. Projects within a community. This is where activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations mostly thrives. These are creating multimodal connections, filling in those gaps in your network for sidewalks, for crosswalks, for first mile, last mile. This is the safe route to school or the safe crossing to reach the grocery store. Community to region projects are sort of a middle ground. This is something like a connection between a residential area and a major job center. This is your protected mixed-use trail to get downtown from where you live, or more of that first mile, last mile piece. This is also an opportunity for activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, but it's gonna look more like a slightly longer, more separated infrastructure, like a mixed-use trail network or a separated protected bike lane. Region-to-region projects, on the other hand, are largely geared toward motor vehicle traffic. Note that this isn't just people driving. This also includes freight or the shipment of goods between communities. This includes longer distance transit trips like intercity buses and so on. So what they saw was that what they did was they categorized projects according to these 3 scales, recognizing that the goals of a region-to-region project are very, very different than the goals of a project within a community. Specifically, they identified these 7 competing priorities: system maintenance, congestion reduction, safety and security, economic growth or largely freight movement, environmental sustainability, system reliability, and project delivery. They have a couple of different metrics that they used to evaluate these priorities, some at the system level, metrics that they applied to the entire package of projects that they were going to fund, and some that applied just to individual projects. Just some examples here. This is not comprehensive, but when we say system maintenance, what they're talking about is, are our roads in good condition? This applies to sidewalks as well. Is the sidewalk smooth and maintained enough that somebody who uses a walker, a wheelchair, or another mobility assistive device can navigate it safely? Congestion reduction is your average commute time. Note that they looked at both driving and riding transit. Safety and security on a small scale is, are you introducing countermeasures to ensure that your road is safe for all people? Or is the project being put in an area that has specifically been identified as a high priority for safety? Economic growth and freight movement largely looks at the delay for freight. Environmental sustainability is looking at VMT per capita. The goal here being to reduce vehicle miles traveled and show a better split of trips across different modes. System reliability also looks a bit at mode split and also looks at filling gaps in the network, a point that has come up already several times in discussion as a high priority. And finally, project delivery. Is the project completed on time, on budget, and is it supported by both the state and local governments? What they did was they wanted to find a way to take these 7 priorities and decide how important are each of these to these 3 different kinds of projects. They did this with an exercise. They brought together several different groups of people. Some were transportation planners and engineers working for various jurisdictions within the region. Some were members of the community and advocacy bodies, some from public health, some from the state. And what they did was they gave people 3 hypothetical projects, starting with within the community. Imagine that there is a missing sidewalk and crosswalk to reach a grocery store. What are the priorities for that project? For example, system maintenance versus congestion reduction. Which of these is more important? And they had people fill that in. So this matrix is just, of the 2, what is more important for this project? Is congestion reduction more important, or is safety security more important? Perhaps it's safety and security. They had folks go through and fill out this entire matrix. And then they did it 2 more times for 2 very, very different projects in those other categories. They added up all these numbers across all of the different people that they engaged, and they used that to come up with a weight. So out of the 21 metrics, somebody awarded system maintenance priority 6 times. That's 28% of the time. They looked across the different kinds of projects and saw that some of these priorities are more or less the same, regardless of the context of the project. Having a well-maintained system is just as important for a project within a community as it is for a project that moves across regions. Other aspects, though, predictably, were more or less important for different kinds of projects. For example, reducing congestion is a pretty low priority for a within community project where your goal is actually the reverse, to allocate space away from cars and to people walking, biking, rolling, sitting, playing, and so on. Whereas region to region, those major intercity roads, congestion reduction is a very important priority. Similar things like environmental sustainability. Shifting people to walk, bike, roll, ride transit is much more important for a within community project, not so important for a region-to-region project. The goal of coming up with these weights was to make sure that a project within a community was not going to be penalized for not meeting metrics related to things that aren't relevant to that project. So what they do now is when they evaluate projects for funding, they still grade them on the same 7 metrics, but they weight those metrics very differently depending on the importance of that metric to that project. This allowed active transportation projects to better compete against major highway widening projects. And the result is striking. Look specifically at this purple color. This is the percentage of funding spent on roadway capacity projects in the 2035 long-range transportation plan before this engagement process versus the 2040 long-range transportation plan afterwards. As you can see, roadway capacity spending went down from 51% or more than half to less than a third. Alternative modes doesn't look like it increased that much, 21 to 28%. But part of the story that's not being told by this graphic is what's going on in this orange piece, this roadway system preservation, operations, and safety. What you're not seeing here in this dramatic increase from one to the other is that a lot of these safety operations preservation projects incorporated complete streets opportunistically. By that I mean a roadway is being repaved and restriped. This is a great opportunity at almost no additional cost to restripe the lanes to be a bit more narrow, to provide a median for people to cross the street with bollards and paint, or to include a bike lane, a wider sidewalk, and so on. So that is also captured in this increase in spending. I'm gonna pause there before I turn things over to Eric. We have a written version of this case study that provides a bit more detail than what I shared with you today. And if there's interest, I'd be happy to share that with folks afterwards as part of that resource folder. Before I pass things on to Eric, who's gonna pivot a bit to talk more about some of these standing metrics and approaches that get in the way of complete streets, does anyone have any questions? We'll also have time for questions at the end, so no worries if none come to mind now.
Hey, this is Julie Eisel. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
No, I just want to say I really like that graphic of a matrix, because speaking to what you all were saying before on not finishing sidewalks and whatnot, it's always an allocation question, right? You know, allocating the money, and it's, as an elected official, that's really hard to do when you're pulled in many direct, well, when you have that same demand in other parts of town, and people are saying, you know, but he got this, I didn't get that. So when you really bring it back to what are the priorities, it makes it easier for us to understand that the public isn't just trying to identify one thing, tree canopy, or, you know, I mean, because there's all sorts of priorities that the community has that they advocate for in isolation that impacts everything else. So I do like that matrix concept.
Thank you so much for sharing. And you're right, it's a real challenge to balance the trade-offs between these competing priorities. And the goal of this exercise for Chattanooga was to make sure that those trade-offs were balanced in a way that actually matched the importance of each of those priorities to the community. So definitely, like I said, I'm very happy to share the more detailed version of that example if it's going to be useful for planning efforts moving forward. Other questions, thoughts, examples to share before we pivot to a different but related topic? If anything comes to mind, do feel free to, as I said, come off mute or put it in the chat. We'll have more time for questions momentarily. I'm going to go ahead and get the slides back up and turn things over to my colleague, Eric.
Thanks. And Julie, to your point, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm on the Plan Commission. We're about to have tonight a little debate in a committee about tree canopy versus skinny streets. So I totally I'm going to be living what you just described. Can completely relate to these trade-off issues. As far as moving on to this next section, Cole did a great job of really talking about the distributional issues involved and some potential solutions and ways to work through that. Of course, competition for funds is important, but it's not the only thing. For one thing, you may not be able to even get your project on the list for consideration if the decision rules screen it out. A few years ago, we were working with Northern Virginia and the state of Virginia, and Arlington and some of the other localities wanted to prioritize first and last mile connections to the Washington Metro. Perfect sense. They invested a lot in that system, and people couldn't easily walk to it in some cases. Didn't show up in the model though. The demand model was not granular enough, so they couldn't get it on the list. Other things are just done by routine, and they don't get put before the MPO board or city council or whoever decides on the program. As you're striping the road, sometimes that's just that's just somebody's following instructions on how to restripe the road or repave it. So these decision rules are really critical, and I should also say, just to respond to a couple points made earlier, not just for retrofitting either. Super critical to get it right the first time. If you need to go back and retrofit disconnected neighborhoods or lack of right-of-way for complete streets after the fact, that's very hard compared to doing it right the first time in terms of cost and disruption, political problems. And the notion that we often don't think about the network that several people mentioned and was related to that, totally true. So that's almost going to be my theme here about going from sort of conventional, I'll say old school metrics that we use to make decisions to more modern, data-driven, network-oriented, access to destinations related metrics is really critical. So with that, Cole, next slide, please. Oh, back one, please. Oh, no, that's right. I'm sorry. I'm going to be talking about a few decision rules. There are many, many more than this, but I'm going to talk at a little bit of length, not much, on level of service, and then talk more briefly on demand models and design and operation. I know that's a little bit of maybe a repeat from the previous sessions here, and a little bit about land use. Again, a bit of a repeat, but I think from a little bit different perspective than you may have heard before. Obviously, we won't be able to get into all of these in all of their aspects, but we will be happy to follow up if there would be some interest on any of this. Next slide, please. So one of the key metrics in transportation world and in land use world to some extent is called level of service, or LOS. It is basically how many cars can move through, or how fast can they move through a point on the network. So it's not network oriented. It doesn't say anything about how fast you can reach a destination. It's just about how the flow is going at that point. And yes, there are LOS rules for other modes, but generally when your public works department or anybody else who's had training in this talks about it, it's really about autos. Next slide. This is an example. We won't get into all the details of it, but it's not really that complicated. If you want to be able to deal with a conversation with your technical people on LOS, it's not a hard hill to climb, really. This is the LOS for a signalized intersection. You can see it's been graded A through F. These are you know, relatively arbitrary cutoffs. They've been established over the decades in practice, but they have some normative, you know, obviously it's a normative scale that the lower you go, the worse it is. And in fact, the definition of E is intolerable. So if you were a city and you thought you had like a very short distance between a couple of destinations and you thought, you know, a 55-second delay at an intersection was okay, that was tolerable, really the field says it's not. And so engineers and planners are just trained to try to push you up this level of service scale. Some cities have said enough, we're never going to get to A, we're never going to get to C, we're going to set it at D and be happy with that or something like that. But in general, this is what's driving a lot of decision making and calls for wider roads and even pushbacks on crossings and for pedestrians and things that might slow down cars. Next slide. As I mentioned, LOS does apply to other modes. And this is a traditional version of the pedestrian level of service. And similar to the car level of service, it's based on how fast you can go down the sidewalk. If nobody's in your way, you can go as fast as you want to. Even if one person's in your way, level B, and this is an abstraction of what the more detailed standards are, that's worse. So in LOS world, traditionally, an empty sidewalk is great. Now, does that make sense? If you are trying to develop economically in an area where you want walking and biking to drive customers or to get people to school or what have you? No, it does not. Many of us would be much more comfortable with a crowd at D&E, safety-wise and just being human. So it doesn't take into account anything like tree canopy or slopes or you know, any of those things that we know really make people want to walk or not, or whether there's a lot of cars driving by next to you that might make you feel unsafe. Next slide. Now, that was sort of the old school LOS for pedestrians. It has improved over the years. So the current version does have, for example, an LOS for intersections. And it does address some of the questions that I was just calling out. So I want to just be fair to the field that this stuff is out there, and it's something that you could, if your practitioner isn't aware of it, you could point them to in the highway capacity manual. So number of lanes to cross, volume, speed of traffic, and even the signal delay. Yes, there's a delay for pedestrians that affects their level of service just as cars do. Now, does this get used very much? Not really, but it's in the book. It could be, and it is getting to be used more, and probably ought to be if we're going to keep LOS around for cars. Next slide. So to sum up on LOS, it has a whole bunch of issues, not all of which I'm going to get into, but have made folks in our world try to either complement it with other metrics or even get rid of it all entirely or downgrade it as a consideration. It's not really comparable across modes because the delay, even the delay for pedestrians getting across the street versus the cars is not really measured the same way. Transit level of service is wholly different. So you can't really say LOS E is the same for the different modes. It doesn't address, the key thing is it doesn't address the network. It doesn't tell you what you can get to. So it's a really poor system-wide measure, even though it gets used as system-wide measure. So people will go around and say, we have good LOS here, bad LOS there. We'll be in nirvana if we bring the bad ones up to good, and that's great. But that doesn't take into account where the destinations are. Are the distance is really great because the neighborhoods are disconnected. We have a bunch of subdivisions that allowed cul-de-sacs. And so even if you can drive as fast as you want, you still got to go a long way. Or are we inducing sprawl through single-use zoning, that sort of thing. As I mentioned, the active transportation LOS exists, but it isn't really people aren't necessarily aware of it or don't use it as much. So motor vehicle dominates. And you may have heard that California has actually banned level of service. That is, I put it in quotes because that's not quite right. But they do have an important review process called CEQA, an environmental review of large land use projects and large transportation projects. And traditionally, LOS had been used as part of that environmental review process. Well, about 5 years ago, the legislature realized that LOS is not a good environmental metric. If anything, it points in the wrong direction because it induces a lot of sprawl. So now what they do is look at, they review both of these types of projects based on the amount of VMT or vehicle miles traveled that are going to be induced by the land use or the highway. So if you widen a highway, you're going to have to mitigate it for induced VMT. If you build infill that will be walkable and will have short car trips, then you'll be fine. But if you build something that is sprawl, you're going to have to mitigate by having a mixture of uses or some other thing. So that's what I have to say about LOS. Just to briefly touch on some of these other decision rules. Demand model, I already sort of touched on this at the beginning with the anecdote about Washington Metro and Northern Virginia. And many people here may already be familiar with demand models, but if you're not, I'm not going to go through this whole thing all in great detail, but demand models were developed in the 50s and 60s as the nation was suburbanizing, and we had an idea that, you know, sprawl was kind of good or inevitable. And we just had to figure out which roads we would widen first because of all this development on the edge. There was a lot of squeaky wheel going on, so we needed a rational way to kind of distribute regional money and make sure that we did that in a way that didn't waste money or didn't disadvantage the less squeaky people. So there was some, you know, it wasn't like crazy. There was some good intent here. But what it doesn't do is address active transportation very much at all. Typically, these models are set up to look at zone-to-zone travel, so regional travel. And the zones, think of a census tract level or, you know, something of that scale. Most of your walking and biking is going to take place within that zone. So if you're looking at zone-to-zone trips, you don't, it's not represented. And the way the models represent the zone-to-zone trips are not with the actual local street network usually, but with sort of centroid connectors. So it does represent big interstates and big highways, but it doesn't represent the local neighborhood streets and collectors that most people are going to walk and bike on. So that's why it didn't, the thing in Northern Virginia where folks wanted to put, you know, very cost-efficient first and last mile sidewalks in didn't show up in the model, and they couldn't get it on the list to begin with. So next slide. I think I've covered all of this. Oh, one last big drawback that when somebody says, hey, it doesn't, the model says we should do this, as I kind of alluded to in the California case, they're very concerned, a big concern that doesn't get addressed very often in planning and allocating resources for capacity projects is that when we try to raise LOS and the speed of cars, we typically want to widen a road. What happens when we widen a road is that more people use it. That's because they might deviate their trips from another route. They might drive during peak hour when they were avoiding it. And eventually land uses will just spread out. It's like now because this road is moving faster, I could buy cheaper land and move my business, you know, 10 minutes further out from where it was before, because people can get there in the same amount of time in their cars. But once that, you know, once everybody does that, the roads fill up again. We don't have any real benefit in travel times. We just have more congestion and more emissions and less ability to access things by walking and biking because they're more spread out. Demand models don't see that at all. That's just not part of what they do. There are some very fancy ones called iterative transportation land use models that get at this to some extent, but the generic ones used by 99% of the field do not. So next slide. Design and operation, I've kind of combined these two things. Operation kind of gets short shrift sometimes because a lot of design elements get addressed in operations or in maintenance, when we repave something or when we decide whether or not we can have a signalized crossing for pedestrians, those sorts of things. They kind of go together. We could separate them, but in the interest of time, we're ending up with a lot of this. This is Orlando. You know, we've got big wide lanes to avoid the chance that 3 trucks might go by and sideswipe each other at the same time. We've got the very minimal sidewalks with a lot of curb cuts, wide curb cuts, not a crossing in sight. So it's not a surprise to anybody here, but we're getting this just in terms of design. Yes, it looks like everywhere USA, really, Shannon. So we shouldn't call out just Charlotte here, or I mean Charlotte or Orlando. This is what we get all over, and what we're trying to avoid when we build new and what we got to retrofit for. So next slide. Why do we have this? It's just useful to know again a little bit. These highways, a lot of them were rural highways and they've been subsumed by sprawl. I lived in Atlanta for 10 years, and so the Buford Highway was our prototypical example of what I just showed, and it was the highway to Buford. But then it became in the 50s and 60s where the suburbs went, and you had just cross sections like I just showed, up and down, and people getting run over trying to get across it. But even where it wasn't actually a rural highway, it was designed for an urban setting, our design rules came from intercity facilities in a lot of times. So a lot of times we say we got to have a 12-foot lane. Well, that's great on the interstate, but not so great on the arterial that runs through or alongside a neighborhood or through a neighborhood. Because of our interest in LOS and faster traffic, we have a hard time creating slower traffic or crossings that might slow traffic. Safe speeds are set by motorists. We have this thing called the 85th percentile rule. We go out and look at how fast cars are going. Of course, if we have long, straight sections with wide lanes, people are going to go fast regardless of what's around them. It just gives a cue that, so we build it the way we've tended to build it. People are going to be going pretty fast, maybe 50, 60 miles an hour, even in an urban area. And we've declared that the 85th percentile motorist is the reasonable motorist, and that's what we should set the speed limit at. Otherwise, we're doing a speed trap. Well, NACDO just put out new guidance that you should be aware of if you haven't already. It came out like a week ago, that counters that and sets safe speeds for urban and suburban facilities that in many cases will be far below the 85th percentile. Which then begs the question of how do you enforce it? And the preferred solution there is to deal with some design issues to slow the traffic. Crossings, warrants are sort of is a technical term for what you need to be able to justify a signal or a crosswalk or a flasher or a stop sign. All of these things have warrants. They tend to be organized around moving cars faster still. Sometimes to get a crossing put in, you have to demonstrate that people are already getting run over or that they're already crossing. It's kind of like, well, we can't build a bridge over this river unless you show that people are drowning trying to swim across it. That's literally the way some are written. So you have the ability locally to deviate from the standard warrants, and a lot of cities are. And I'll come back to this a little bit in our discussion with the case study, but often we have prescriptive guidance on a lot of things. So we've got to have a certain lane width, as I mentioned before. Yeah, on the ADA side, we now have good prescriptive guidance since the 90s that when we rebuild or build a sidewalk crossing, you've got to put in the curb cut. That's great. But mostly it's the complete streets facilities are don't have this prescriptive guidance that makes people put them in. And I will show you the MassDOT example when we come to that, but that is another way to address some of these design and operation issues. And finally, next slide, land use. Transportation land use, obviously sides of the same coin, often siloed, often not considered together, but you could build the best streetscape ever in the public right-of-way, and if this is what people have to walk to actually get to their destinations, you're still going to have problems. Next slide. And being on a plan commission, I could give you a very, very long list of issues with this, but I'm just going to tick a few off. For example, we require off-street parking, which makes it cheap and easy for people to drive and harder for people to walk, spreads out land uses. We require often big setbacks, like you just saw in that picture. So things are farther from the sidewalk, harder to get to, often through a very hostile walking environment. We restrict density, so things are spread out. We separate land uses, so the trip between my neighborhood and my workplace or my store or whatever it is, it can often be very far. We require transportation impact assessments on new development. Often anything of any size has to go through a TIA process. And typically what happens is your transportation engineers look at it and say, well, it's going to create congestion, LOS problems on this road, therefore you have to widen the road. So that just has this vicious cycle. It doesn't really ever address, rarely addresses other modes. Sometimes it does, it's getting to be better, but across the average typical practice is still just to look at volume to capacity ratios and LOS on traffic impact assessment. So again, very, very partial list, but just want to highlight that land use is a critical component to success in all of this, as well as the decision rules around transportation. So next slide. That all seems like a problem, and it is. What do we do about it? Some of it is picking off some of those things one at a time. Let's deal with parking minimums or setbacks or something like that. That's all great. We're also pretty excited about a metric called accessibility or access to destinations, which we've been using in Virginia, partly as a response to that problem that I mentioned before around the country. We're doing a lot with the cities of Houston and Los Angeles. So if this were of interest locally in Charlotte, we can go into more detail and talk about what it might look like there. But access to destinations or accessibility does take into account the network conditions. So how fast can I go on the road? Or if I'm walking, how amenable is the walking environment? So that, is it safe? So those sorts of things, but also how far do I have to go? So if things are really spread out, your access to destinations may be poor regardless of your speed. If they're close together, speed may not matter so much. Next slide. This is a little bit about what it looks like. And if you're familiar with Walk Score, it's kind of like that, except we're able to look at before and after for different projects and to look for gaps in the network and things like that with these tools. So this is Virginia Beach, Virginia. If you've ever been there, 264 is an interstate that runs from Norfolk down to the beach. This happens to be an activity center sort of in the middle between Norfolk and the beachfront. Neighborhoods to the south, stores and employment to the north, but no good way to get across. So if you were going to go the quarter mile from one of those neighborhoods to one of those stores, you would probably end up driving. So you could imagine a project that would complete that network, the walking network, and we've drawn in a couple of such crossings where people might be able to use, and we're able to then calculate the change in access on a 1 to 100 scale. And if you were looking at different options, you could sketch in a bunch of them and see which one meets the needs the best. if you had, scarce resources, which you always do, you could look at different proposals from around the region and see which one is providing the most access. If you're concerned about equity, which you should be, you can see which ones provide new access to traditionally marginalized groups or those with the least access to start with. So it's a pretty cool tool. Virginia has been scoring projects across the state with it for the last 5 years, and it has a lot of upside, not just for transportation projects, for citing land use projects as well. So one last slide before I desist. Access to destinations, again, is a cool metric that, while still emerging, there are thousands of papers written on this every year, but still may be unfamiliar to a lot of practitioners, or they may have read about it but not been aware that it's kind of applicable to practice at all. But it considers the distance and the speed and the level of stress for active transportation in calculating whether you can get to destinations. Brings together transportation and land use. You can compare across modes, unlike level of service. We're just looking at travel times. Travel times degraded for level of stress sometimes, but it is travel times. And it can see really short trips, as you saw in that map in Virginia Beach. We're looking at the actual street network in neighborhoods. We're not looking at these big zones. So we can see, we can even go down to the parcel level in some cases if we want to. And finally, if we care about some outcomes like mode shift or vehicle miles traveled for congestion or emission purposes, we can predict those because we know that when we change accessibility levels to either make car access greater or lesser in relation to the other modes, we know that we will get travel behavior that tracks that. So all pretty exciting stuff, and just could go on and on about that, but I won't. I think I will leave it there and see if we have any questions before we get into the review.
I have a question. This is Dana Stujenki again from the town of Matthews. Both Charlotte and the town of Matthews have our modeling software. Well, Charlotte and Matthews both have Community Viz, which is a land use based tool. And we in the town of Matthews we're right now doing, we're creating a sub-area model with using Community Viz, and it's going to interplay with Transmodeler to do a sub-area transportation plan. One of the things that has driven me crazy from the get-go is what you're talking about, the small zones and not being able to really understand the Greenway network, the sidewalk network. We can model for big transit projects like a light rail potentially coming through, but we can't model for those smaller zone trips. And that's, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or that you've seen models that are successful. I hear you talk about access to destination, which sounds like is that an additional modeling tool? Is that what that is?
So it's a concept that can be done through different platforms. So at one level, you could just use simple ArcGIS, and we've been successful at doing that. We're doing a school siting exercise in Minnesota using just Network Analyst, which is a tool that comes, it's a basic tool of ArcGIS. There are a couple of brand name products that come a little bit fancier for one reason, or which I could go into, but they're called Conveil and Sugar Access. We've used both of those. In Virginia, we're using TransCAD. I have not used Community Viz. I am familiar with the title, but would have to look under the hood to see exactly how that would work, but you might be able to. It comes down to the quality of the networks that you have. If you have a sidewalk network, it becomes relatively simple to do this, even in Network Analyst on the cheap. Sometimes you have to buy those networks and that's where some of these more licensed tools come in. But anyway, if you're interested, destination access is a concept, and it could be done in a variety of ways.
Okay, thank you.
I see a question in the chat from, or maybe a comment from Andrew Ventresca. He says, thank you. We're looking at ways to change our TIA findings, getting away from the LOS methods. One thing we have done is if a TIA shows something like a turn lane is warranted, we will require the developer to provide fee in lieu instead to be spent towards pedestrian or bicycle improvements in the area, as the town of Davidson does not want to see any additional travel lanes or width added to the roadway.
That's a great practice and a great point. A couple years ago, we worked with the city of LA, and I can put in we could send around later. We produced a report called Modern Mitigation, which is really a way to get around the old TIA. We're mitigating the travel, and it's all TDM focused and transportation demand management. So there is fee in lieu for bike and ped improvements, or they can make direct improvements. They can also do bus passes. They can do on-site daycare to avoid trip making from that. They can do mixed use. California is really in the lead. Pasadena got going on this a while ago and sort of developed its own program of mitigation through these other measures. There's an ongoing one. The LA one hasn't been implemented yet that we worked on. Our report reflects our work on it. There's also one that's already in place in San Francisco and some other places. The San Francisco one is really cool. It has a calculator where you put in your address, what you want to build. It tells you how many TDM points you have to achieve, which are really based on the parking stalls you want to put in. And then you go to a measure list and you start checking, I'm going to do bus passes or on-site daycare or mixed use or what have you. So it's a huge opportunity to turn the whole paradigm around from transportation problem equals more lanes to transportation problem equals better siting and demand management. So that's thank you, Andrew, for that.
I see that Shri Ganison has written, Orlando gave up on building light rail about 15 years ago, even with level of service being an E in most places. With a few transportation engineers here from City of Orlando, it might be worthwhile to understand a summary of the issue. And then Shannon wrote, is anyone from CDOT on the call? And if so, could you talk about how CDOT uses LOS to make decisions?
Doesn't look like it. I would just say on LOS, there are some good reasons to keep it around. If you're going to put a whole bunch of new driveways along an arterial and have turning movements in and out, that's going to sort of defeat the purpose of the arterial, maybe a rural road. So the DOTs may be using it for something like that. I don't mean to call them out that they should never think about it. Just that it's not a good systematic network type of measure.
What's the best level of service to use for pedestrians? Like, is there a model out there that is the one that's probably the best one that you've seen?
Well, it goes, the one in the highway capacity manual goes from A to E, just like the cars does. So if that's what you mean. We use level of traffic stress, and I could send you a paper that brings in some of the considerations that we use based on some new research that isn't in the highway capacity manual yet. Unfortunately, it's hard to have a standard because different cities have different data available. So some will have really good, traffic speed and volume data, and some won't. Some won't even have network data for where the sidewalks are. So it's a little hard to have, you know, and all those things are really well documented on the highway side. So until we have super robust network data, we have to kind of like, it's hard to standardize.
I would add to that an additional challenge of performance measurement for people walking, pedestrians specifically, is, as Eric mentioned, the lack of data. I see many communities struggling to even have data on whether or not a sidewalk exists in a location, much less the more qualitative and arguably just as important data on the quality of that sidewalk. Is it well maintained? Is it smooth? Is it accessible to somebody who might move a little bit more slowly? Yes, how wide is it? So I would say it is definitely a challenge. And I would also think through metrics related to, for example, when a crosswalk exists and when that crosswalk is timed. Eric kind of highlighted to contrasting aspects of level of service with that, right? We're penalizing the vehicle level of service, often the most important metric in making decisions, anytime that car has to wait at a light. However, particularly for somebody who might be older, who might move a little bit more slowly, or who might use a mobility assistive device to get around, having sufficient time to make it across that street is literally a matter of life or death. So even thinking through like smaller scale metrics related to how you establish crosswalk timing is, I think, really important for the safety and quality of life of pedestrians. We have one more section to get through before we wrap up for this module. Any other questions for Eric? Any other examples to share about anything that we've discussed so far? All right. As I mentioned, our last section is going to be a real life case study. We're going to look at a road in Charlotte that has actually already come up a bit in discussion at the first module. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that some of the key topics that we covered across all 4 modules are just fresh in your mind. So I'm going to very, very quickly just do a brief overview of some of what we've discussed so far. In Module 1, we talked about the importance of a policy. Complete Streets is ultimately about creating a complete network so that people can safely and comfortably access all of the key destinations that they need through whatever method of transportation they choose or rely upon. Earlier in today's discussion, an example was brought up about a Complete Streets project that took 3-4 years of engagement to even get put into place. Fighting that uphill battle, one project at a time, is a really, really challenging and resource inefficient way to ultimately get you to that complete network. However, adopting a policy that puts in place practices to support Complete Streets and revises or removes practices like many of the ones Eric discussed that impede Complete Streets is a really important way to make sure that every project is considered an opportunity to improve Complete Streets. How a policy does that depends on the strength of the policy, but the gold standard is that those policies put in place binding steps like revising design guidelines and processes. Some of the copying and pasting seems to have gone awry here, so there's a lot of process revision going on, and frankly, that is quite accurate. What you're not seeing here are improving processes related to community engagement, adopting performance measures that match your goals and incorporating that into your project selection process, and conducting ongoing trainings to make sure that those new practices are disseminated across the people that need to understand them to implement them or to support and advocate for them. And also that you've got accountability to the public, that you've got hard deadlines to meet, that the initiative is inclusive of the communities that you're trying to serve, specifically low-income communities, Black and Latinx communities, perhaps immigrant communities, the disability community, and so on, really depending on your jurisdiction. And also that work is cross-departmental, that the other agencies and departments that have a role to play are engaged throughout. In Module 2, we talked about how a Complete Streets process differs from a traditional transportation planning process, namely that we're moving away from prioritizing the free flow of cars through that level of service metric that Eric addressed, and moving toward better balancing the needs of different users of the roadway, that we're moving away from widening our intersections and lanes to forgive bad driving behavior, and instead narrowing those lanes and intersections to encourage people to be more alert about their surroundings, to drive at a safer, slower speed where potential conflict with people walking and biking exists, and so on and so forth. Really moving away from a model where car is king to a model where people move in different ways, all of them valid, and we need a way to balance those needs in a fair and safe and equitable way. We also talked about some examples of how to go about remaking, retrofitting, redesigning some major arterial corridors in suburban contexts. Often these roads, or stroads as they're sometimes called, serve this dual conflicting use between moving through traffic fastly across a place and moving to traffic, whether on foot or bike or wheel or car, to the destinations along a place. These are the de facto main streets that are also major routes. So these are some of the key actions that can be used to improve and change those corridors, such as identifying centers and restructuring land use to increase walkability, re-engineering the street to better prioritize the safety of people walking, biking, and rolling, dealing with parking, perhaps removing really sprawl-inducing parking minimums, or at least moving parking behind the uses to bring those buildings closer to the street and create that more comfortable, enclosed feeling, injecting new housing opportunities where possible, locating governmental facilities strategically, that includes schools, creating a catalytic project to kind of show what is possible and really drum up support and buzz for change, and establishing place management. In Module 3, we talked about the interconnection between a variety of different kinds of policies and land use regulations, all of which play an important role on both the transportation and land use side of things to create a walkable, bikeable, rollable, safe community. That includes parking policies, development incentives such as transit-oriented development, public infrastructure like complete streets, the community engagement important to making sure that housing is affordable and meets the needs of the community, and of course zoning, those form-based standards that make sure that places are mixed use, that key destinations are close together to make it easier and more convenient for people to walk and bike to reach them. And finally, we also addressed some strategies to form and maintain a successful coalition to collaborate on complete streets, starting with a stakeholder analysis, and then moving through this process to achieve a goal, to determine your organizational structure and how you're going to go about reaching your goals through a campaign plan, all the way up to assessing those results and determining next steps, whether that be dissolving the coalition once its role is complete or pivoting to additional related actions. So as I said, that was just a very, very cursory overview, just to refresh your memory on some of the other things that we have discussed before today. The rest of this time, we're largely going to turn over to you. As I said, we're about to talk through a real world case study. Specifically, we're going to look at Statesville Avenue. So before I move forward, what I have for you before we just show discussion questions and, like I said, turn things really over to you, I've highlighted a few key points along this road that really demonstrates the trade-off between that free flow, fast movement of traffic to reach downtown Charlotte or to leave downtown Charlotte, with the need for people to safely get across the street on foot, on wheel, or with a bicycle. So before I show those points of interest, I believe Meg is going to say a little bit more about this street.
Thanks, Cole. That was a great intro. So many of you are familiar with this area. It's just north of I-277, which kind of borders the uptown of Charlotte. And this is an area that is undergoing a lot of change. It's so close to uptown and the property values have increased dramatically. That has attracted a lot of new development to the area. It's an interesting mix of industrial uses to the farther north part within Charlotte, and then a lot of residential a little bit south, farther south, closer to I-277. The Bright Walk community on the west side of Statesville Avenue was recently built, and that includes single family homes, townhomes. There's also some apartment properties just to the north of that. The Charlotte's Men's Shelter is just north, closer to Atondo Avenue. Also, Camp North End is a really interesting community asset along Statesville Avenue. It's a 76-acre site that it's been everything from a Ford car manufacturing site to a quartermaster depot during one of the world wars, and then they manufactured missiles there, and it was has had a variety of uses, and now has become a really vibrant part of that community, and a place where a lot of businesses and art are benefiting from. I think one of the features that really defines this area within Charlotte is physical boundaries in the form of I-77 to the west, I-85 to the north, and then when you look towards the east, the freight rail yard there is a huge barrier between that community and the ones that are to the east of it. Another thing I think that we should note is that because this part of Statesville Avenue is so close to I-77, it is often used as an alternative when there's a traffic crash or other closure of I-77. And we might expect that as the population of Charlotte continues to grow, that more people will be using this route to commute to work. It goes all the way north through Cornelius and Davidson, and it serves as a main street, and it goes all the way up to Mooresville. So it's a really critical road, not only for the local community, but also it's being used for regional commuting. So I think we want to think about, how does this road function within the community? There are a number of parks that on either side of the road. So you've got houses on different sides. There's parks on different sides. There's the Double Oaks pool, which is one of only a few public swimming pools in Charlotte. But we also want to think about that community to region connection and think about some of the barriers there, not only getting across the road, but also as we think about how this road connects the community to the rest of Charlotte. There are some real barriers that kind of hem this community in physically. And I'll also say that Sustain Charlotte has been partnering with the North End Community Coalition, which is a coalition of neighborhoods in this area that have gotten together to work on quality of life issues. And we've done some walkability audits there. We've done some work advocating with the residents with Mecklenburg County Park and Rec. And for example, in the Druid Hills neighborhood park, there was a street, Rhodey Avenue, that went literally right through the park. And together with residents successfully had Park and Rec close that street to traffic so that it'll be safe for kids to go from the playground to the basketball courts and so on. So it's been a really interesting area to see changes happen and to see the residents really taking a very active role in speaking up for what needs to be done, and also going to what was shared earlier, the concept of how much of the decision making is done by the kind of squeaky wheel method versus how much is done based on objective criteria. This is an area that has a lot of needs and has made those needs known, but also it's going to require a very long-term commitment to giving the community what it needs from an equity perspective so that they can do the things that many of us take for granted, like being able to cross the street in front of our home safely or get to the bus stop. A lot of people in this area ride the bus to and from work. And anytime you go anywhere on the bus, you not only have to safely get to that bus stop, but then you also have to cross the street on either your inbound or outbound trip.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Meg. I'm not going to say too much more than that, except to take you on a brief tour of key points that I mentioned. I know that many, if not all of you on the call, are even more familiar with this street than I am. Just to point your attention to some of what I observed when virtually visiting this street. I believe this is the pool that you mentioned. So what you can see here is on one side of the street, well, really on both sides of the street, we have a bus stop, but one of those bus stops is across the street. We have apartments specifically for older adults. We have this recreation center that serves as one of the only public pools. And in this instance, there is a spot treatment to help with this trade-off of moving traffic along the street and moving people across the street. It's a little hard to see here. I'm going to show you a zoomed in image in a minute, but there is a mid-block crossing with a median refuge. There's signage, there's bollards. Because this refuge kind of takes up some of the street space, there is this sense of enclosure or narrowing for drivers, which might help them to slow down. And having this little bit of median refuge in the middle means that somebody, particularly an older adult, can just worry about crossing one side of the street than the other. This is not a perfect intervention. It's certainly better than what you're going to see as we continue moving north. But it's just the first example I wanted to highlight about that trade-off between expecting traffic to slow down or even stop and yield, therefore creating that delay that's going to knock their level of service down, and the importance of making sure that people can safely make their way across this street without being injured and ideally without even being stressed. As I said, there's not really a stop condition here. The pedestrian or the person crossing the street still does need to rely on the driver to read these cues in the environment and be alert and slow down or even stop. As you move north, you see a lot more examples like this, where there's a bus stop across from some key destinations, but not even this level of intervention to help people cross. Farther north, and I'm kind of tracking how far north we've gone over here on the left, we have a bus stop across from a homeless shelter. This site also provides important services related to employment, and these X's are unfortunately the sites where people were killed while walking across this street. When we look a little bit more at what this street looks like, it's easy to see why. You can just barely see that there are curb cuts on either side of the street. They even have that little tactile mat to help somebody who is perhaps living with complete or partial blindness understand where the crosswalk is. I'll be honest, I can't really see where the crosswalk is. It's not marked, it's not painted. Notice that the road is much wider here. We've gone from just the 2 lanes in that previous example to now what appears to be 5. There's not really a median to stop on. I wouldn't necessarily consider this little bit of median here sufficient, but this is a crosswalk. This is the place where if you're trying to get from this bus stop to these important services, where you're expected to cross the street. To kind of point to the counterpoint, I mentioned this is all about trade-offs. If I am a person driving along this street, I certainly don't want to strike and hurt or kill anybody. That in and of itself is a traumatic experience, but I would have no way whatsoever of knowing that I should expect somebody to cross here. That is a really concerning conflict. We see more of this at other key sites as well. Moving a little bit farther north, we've now crossed over from Statesville Avenue to Statesville Road, but we see the same kinds of conditions. We've got a bus stop on one side of the street, a church on the other, and here again we have these little suggestions of curb cuts, but no markings, no signage, and if you are somebody who is using a walker or a wheelchair or who perhaps has difficulty stepping up and down, you actually don't even have a way to get across this median. I'm going to actually turn things over to Eric, who's just going to point out how this lack of a safe and accessible place to cross the street, if you were someone who really was either uncomfortable jaywalking or unable to because of that median, how much time it adds to your trip to go to the nearest crosswalk, which I don't even believe is on this image.
Right, thanks, Cole. So going back to our sort of network paradigm, which we could also deal with this with a design rule, but and I'll come to that. But if we think about access to destinations, you step off that bus, you want to get to that church, you're attending church, you work there, or this is just an example. This could be any other thing along this road. You're in a wheelchair, or you just don't want to take your life in your hands and walk across there. The nearest signalized, I think the nearest break in the median at all involves about a 2,000-foot walk, about a third of a mile, as opposed to just walking straight across the street, which is a few hundred feet. So, when we do our network analysis, we take these sorts of impediments into account, and we can actually quantify them, because that's helpful when you're trying to allocate resources or get your public works director to they need something that isn't just know it when I see it also. So next slide. We can actually go to some survey data and see how far people are willing to walk and how much an extra walk will degrade their ability to walk. And utility here just means what percentage of people are walking for these different trip purposes or traveling by transit or auto. So the dark blue line on the left, which falls off really substantially, is walk to work. So we can see based on surveys that people who walk to work, 90% of them almost are going within 10 minutes. And if it's further than that, they're not going to do it. They will resort to some other mode, usually driving, or not be able to access work, which is also another problem. So next slide. In this particular case, that 2,000-foot walk is around a 7.5 minute trip, not counting waiting at the light, which it could be a separate issue. And if this were a workplace, you know, it would reduce your people's chances of walking it by something like 70-some%. And if you were attending church for a non-work trip, maybe you have a little bit more time. People tend to walk longer for non-work trips. It's still around half. Now, this is a combo of transit and walk, which gets more complicated. The tools that we use can take that into account too, but I just wanted to just use the walk portion of that trip to illustrate how you can quantify some of these impediments and then figure out what need to be fixed. Next thing. But you may just want to have a rule of thumb. Maybe you don't have to get to that level of analysis to fix things like this. This is the controlling criteria that I mentioned when I first talked that Massachusetts DOT has adopted after just dealing with these problems forever. And you may think, well, Boston, it's really dense, not really the same, but they have lots of sprawl. They have lots of these very same sorts of facilities around Western Mass and the suburbs. So I think this is really applicable all across. I'll put the criteria into the folder that everybody can get. The walk, bike, and transit pieces are only about 3 pages long, 1 page a piece. So pretty simple, but it's like, hey, engineer, hey, planner, you got to do this. And if you don't, you got to get the Secretary of Transportation to sign off and you got to justify it. So instead of like having to go get exceptions to do the right thing, which happens too often because it slows down cars, now you have to get an exception if you're going to do the wrong thing and not facilitate active transportation. And in this case, wherever there's a bus stop, even if it's a state road that's an arterial, they got to have a crossing within 250 feet. So you don't have that 2,000-foot walker. The most you could have there would be 500 feet up and back. So just an example of a design way to address this issue without getting all the way into the network analysis. But the network analysis is useful too in looking at all these across the whole city. Back to you, Cole.
Thanks, Eric. And to that, I'll just add that in this hypothetical example, we've pointed out not just the length of time and distance it would take someone to walk all the way around to the nearest crosswalk, but again, just to remind you that this might be a trip that somebody using a wheelchair or a walker has to make simply because that median is an insurmountable barrier. So just think through not just the amount of time and distance added for that person to reach the church from the bus stop or vice versa, but the fact that that length of trip might be even more strenuous for somebody who is using one of those mobility assistive devices to complete. Just to bring focus back to the street once more, you're really not going to see anything new here. I think we've sufficiently beaten this dead horse before we turn things over to you. But I just want to flag one more example. Again, we're pretty far north at this point on Statesville Road. We've got on one side of the street the bus stop, and on the other, a middle school, a public park. We also have what you can sort of start to see here and what extends far to the west, a lot of residential housing. So this could be folks that are either walking to school or walking to reach that park. And again, what we see is that the crosswalk is pretty lacking. The northbound image you can see, we've got the curb cuts with that tactile piece. We have this little tiny bollard and this median, but you're crossing, what is this, 5 lanes of traffic, including this pretty wide slip lane coming off the intersection. And going north, there is no real signage whatsoever to indicate to a driver that they should be prepared to stop or yield to a child walking to school beyond this little bollard. Coming south, there is this marking, but again, it's If you're moving as fast as this road encourages you to drive, you're going to see this kind of late. So just again, to reemphasize the point that we're dealing here with a trade-off, that like being able to reach Charlotte along this route via your vehicle is certainly a valid use of this street, but so is being able to cross it safely, and we need to find a better way to balance that trade-off between those two competing uses. So we're going to stop talking because we know that you probably have a lot more to say about this street than we do, but just to give you a sense of where we're going from here, we have 3 discussion questions for you. First, we're going to talk about the problems that you've seen and experienced at the site, related to design, related to your experiences walking, biking, driving, and so on, or riding transit. Then we're going to talk about problems in policy and practice that have created those problems at the site, or that have made it difficult to resolve them. And finally, we'll brainstorm some policy solutions. So I am going to share each of these questions and then stop the share so that we can see each other to discuss them. Starting with the problems at the site. How does the design of Statesville Avenue and farther north Statesville Road impact your experience walking, driving, biking, rolling, or riding transit? Do you feel safe and comfortable? Do you feel like you're able to reach key destinations on either side of the road?
Hi, Cole. This is Kenya Templeton. I was a car-free full-time bike and transit commuter for 8 years, and I had to go up Statesville Avenue quite a bit. Statesville Avenue, if I'm not mistaken, is a state road, part of it. And one of the things is that it has a bike lane there, but with the speed that people are going up Statesville Road, you don't feel comfortable in that bike lane whatsoever. So a lot of people, unless I see a bike group coming through, you don't see anyone using that bike lane. Most of the time people are using the sidewalk, and there are a lot of curb cuts in that sidewalk, and people aren't paying attention when they're pulling out to see if cyclists are coming through. My stepsister lived on Statesville Avenue right at Sunset, and her kids went to that middle school there for 1 year. And part of the reason why we took them out of that school was because it was dangerous crossing there to get to the school and to the park. She eventually either had to drive them there, or they would have to walk in a really big group so that somebody can visually see the group walking across there. So that's my experience with going up and down that street.
Thank you for sharing. Other challenges that people have experienced or observed with this road?
I see a few comments in the chat box. Do you want me to read them?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so Andrew shared it's an interesting road from a cyclist perspective, also as it's probably the safest way to cross 85 from the northern part of the county. And while it has bike lanes on and off, it has no facilities near the interchange of 85, which is the busiest part. I shared that there's also a lot of large trucks on it due to the proximity to I-77 and 85 and that industrial kind of warehouse area, just north of Atondo Avenue. Philip said, I've walked Statesville on occasion and it really isn't friendly for pedestrians either. Most of the people walking are walking because they don't have an option. It looks like, oh, so Eric replied to Shri about the different technologies. A few more comments here. Kenya said, great point, Philip. And I think that's all we have.
Great. Any other problems at this site that haven't already been addressed before we move on to the underlying problems in policy that produce these situations? So far, we have the challenges getting across the street. We have challenges cycling along and across the street, the conflict with those curb cuts. So not even just the intersections, but the curb cuts that provide access to the destinations on that road. We also have the conflict of freight moving along this street, as well as the buses.
Oh, I have one other thing I want to bring up.
Sure.
Again, like I said, I was a car-free cyclist and using transit. And when I compare South Boulevard and how quickly things are put up for South Boulevard for walking and cycling versus when I look at places like Statesville Avenue, there is a clear, definitive difference in approach to those situations. And granted, Statesville Avenue and Statesville Road is much wider, but I find it interesting that there was at that one instance that you had, there's like one little tiny bollard where if you go down many parts of South Boulevard, there's huge signage, there's lighting, there's curb cuts. I mean, it's like they threw everything that could possibly be used in to help let people know someone's trying to cross the street, where they don't put that same attention to the Statesville Road and Statesville Avenue.
Kenya, that is a really, really great point, and I'm glad you voiced it. The way that we have allocated resources and attention has not been equitable or fair. I think that's as I said, it's a really important point and a great transition to the next question, which is, how do existing policies and practices perpetuate problems at the site? I encourage you not just to think about the design problems that have been raised, but also the inequity, the lack of attention given to this road versus others like it. So I'll turn things back to you all again to talk about the policies and practices you've seen that have created these conditions and made it hard for you to change them.
Well, I think in comparing it to South Boulevard, the reason why we have more development there is obviously because of the light rail, and being that there is no transit line planned up Statesville Avenue to the north, you're not going to get the developers there that want to build what you're going to pay for, your crosswalks and your bollards and everything. So you just don't have the development interest, I'll say, up these areas that aren't planned for this mass transit. I mean, as we can say, even looking at the Blue Line extension, that area is blowing up too.
But to your point, I will bring up with South Boulevard, and Meg and I have had this conversation recently, the areas that need the equity in bike and pedestrian crossings that need it the most because people depend on bike and pedestrian more are the areas that are getting it the least along the southern part of the links. So I understand that there are organizations that are getting the oil because there's a squeaky wheel. But when you look at specifically, I'm going to point out, is right below Tyvola on South Boulevard, that's where the poorest people live along the links, but they have least ability to get to the links compared to every other station along South Boulevard.
This is Maureen. I just would like to say, Andrew, I believe you're raising a very good point. What I've found in Charlotte in the years that I've lived here is that if it's not under development, then it's not going to happen. It's going to be backburnered. And yes, I belong to a group that's a squeaky wheel, and it's not something that happens very fast. So equity is part of that issue. And it is based on, if you've got, this has always been, and I know this way it is across this country, but I've seen it first up with Charlotte, is that the developers lead.
I'm going to use this opportunity to sort of merge the third question in. It sounds like there's a challenge here that we've got, on the one hand, the squeaky wheels that perpetuate inequity. We've got the opportunism of developers bringing in dollars that can improve a street, and the city, the county, the region does not have to spend that. And unfortunately, that leaves a really critical gap in not delivering resources and improvements to the communities that could stand to benefit from them the most. So as you're voicing these policy challenges and others that folks have been waiting to bring up, I also encourage you to think through solutions. What needs to change in policy to resolve that? How can we change our approach to delivering projects to make sure that the situation that you all are acknowledging right now does not continue, and to make sure that those unmet needs are met moving forward?
This is
I could
Maureen
add,
again. But,
or you go ahead, Maureen.
okay, I think part of it is having a bigger community voice, and that's something that we are working on, is gathering a bigger community voice, because connectivity has been a project that we have worked on in the East community for 9 years actively, and we find that we are constantly in a chase, a vicious cycle here. And one of the things that we're looking at now is being able to address both the county and the city to take a look at, work together with a master plan, so that, you know, talking earlier about the matrix, so that you could see when there's an opportunity to provide some connectivity and to have a really effective multimodal, safe means of transportation. Because, you know, in our city and county, we have the county with Park and Rec doing the trail connectivity, in the city having transportation and overland. And you know, they say they work together, but they don't. And they do know this, but we do have to look at forcing them to take a look at it together. And that's something that we're working toward.
Thank you, Maureen. Eric, did you want to chime in with either a policy problem or solution?
Sure. I mean, I think part of the solution is the policy, but those have to be crafted in such a way for all the things that we've covered in all the workshops so far, but also making sure there isn't loopholes in those policies. And if we can get those policies translated into actual regulation at times, because policies are nice, but they don't have legal force like the regulations do. So you want to, you know, make sure those are crafted and then they're translated properly into regulation. You also have to work on the, you know, the master plan, which we are doing, so you can communicate what the bigger picture is throughout the whole city. So you can see if there is segments, neighborhoods or sections that are missing, that they can then make sure those get filled. But it also then has to be a piece of how you get everything built. So there's going to be always larger projects that developers aren't going to be able to build, and you're going to need to make sure you get that funding and that put together, and the community, the whole community, can understand what's going on, so you can decide how to pay for it and make it a reality. So I think we are working all those things. Until it's actually done, we got to make sure all the details and pieces of them are done properly, and we don't, with equities involved, oversight, and it's successfully communicated to the public, so we can get all of those pieces passed and built.
This to me is where the value of coalitions comes in. There's a real economy of scale when you have 40 or 50 neighborhoods that are together asking the city to really take a close look at their needs, versus those 40 or 50 neighborhoods where maybe 8 to 10 of them have the ability and the time to be really engaged, and the other, you know, 80% are left out of that conversation. And then even among those 8 or 10 that are really engaged, they're all kind of scrabbling for the same limited resources. So, you know, I think as a stepping stone from moving away from the squeaky wheel model and really moving towards the citywide equity model, there's such value in coalitions. I'm glad that we covered that in a previous module.
I know we're running short on time, and we're going to turn it back to Maureen in just a moment to kind of explain what the next steps are. But before I do that, any other policy challenges or solutions that anyone wants to raise in the context of Statesville Avenue and streets like it throughout the Charlotte region?
Can I add a point? And it may be for those of us who live in Charlotte, kind of a, yeah, of course, that's how it is. So the men's shelter is on Statesville, and it is in a lower socioeconomic area as compared to South Park or other areas. So I think it's just demonstrative of what lots of the problems are. So squeaky wheel problem. If you have a heavily service reliant population who is somewhat cut off or not safe, they are likely not the squeaky wheel that some of the more affluent South Park, South Side pick a South people. So there's that. So there's the whole squeaky wheel doesn't work necessarily in their favor at that point. And then if it is brought up, and I can't speak to whether or not it has been, it's again a population who may not be deemed as relevant or important as others. So I think it's just kind of the cycle of, well, it's a lower income area with what some may say is like a less desirable population. So we're not necessarily concerned about them, whoever that, you want to say them are, having access or safe access. So I would assume that that's not deemed as one of the more important aspects of where do we have concerns for complete streets. And it just kind of continues around that circle, like, okay, well, we'll just pass that up. And it just, deteriorates until, I think Maureen made the point of, it comes to a point of gentrification when then, there might be a renewed vigor towards investing in those areas.
And some people will actively try to block anything that improves access to, for example, people living in shelters, people living in communities of color. So I think that needs to be named when it happens. And it often happens under the guise of, well, we have to preserve neighborhood character, which sometimes is code for not wanting people who don't look like you to be able to access the community.
Absolutely. There are a lot of really complicated societal problems, even beyond the scope of transportation at play, that impact this work. This is only a start to this conversation. I hope it's not an end. Unfortunately, it is an end for our time today. So before we do fully run out of time, I definitely encourage you keep thinking about these questions, keep talking about them. I'm going to turn things back to Emily to talk through what happens next.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you again, Eric and Cole, for a great module today. I've really appreciated hearing from both them and from the whole group of participants as we talk about your work to improve health equity by building activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. The next steps, as I've mentioned in previous models, we will be working to build a brief memo with recommendations for your community that we will be sharing. Additionally, next week, we will be sharing a resource folder and a survey. Essentially, we want to be able to evaluate how we have done. It's a great opportunity to get feedback from you all, particularly since this, again, as you all know, would have normally been an in-person workshop. And as we move to this sort of virtual world, we're looking for feedback to see what ways we could improve the engagement. So please participate in that survey and let us know what you think. I want to thank everyone on behalf of Smart Growth America for your time and participation. I want to again thank Rayo Community Health and Sustain Charlotte for your partnership on the ground for bringing this workshop to Charlotte. And this is all made possible by Active People Healthy Nation, which is an initiative of the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at the CDC. So I just wanted to make sure that we thanked everyone who's been involved. Great thanks to all the participation from people on the ground in Charlotte. Again, it was a learning exchange, so it's so important to have your input, your perspectives, and hearing from your experiences there. So that's really informing the work as we go forward. Again, please look for the resource folder and survey coming next week. And in the coming weeks, we will be sharing the recommendations memo. So that is all from us for now. Thanks again to everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out, follow up, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.